The air in Bristol's Market Square 1870 was a pungent mix of stale fish, rough wool, and the icy, judgment-laden breath of Victorian high society. This was not a place for the fragile, the unprotected, or the disgraced. Yet there stood Livia Astor, a vision of shattered grace at the tender age of 25, bearing the cruel burden of two sins the city would never forgive: poverty and visible pregnancy. Her simple, patched morning dress was a stark, black stain against the vibrant cruelty of the wealthy world around her, a world that once welcomed her, and now sought her utter erasure. Livia was a widow, yes, but one stripped of honor and means after her young lieutenant husband fell, leaving her with debt and worse, a life growing visibly within her. With no pension, no family support, and nowhere left to turn, necessity drove her to this ultimate desperate exposure, laying out the last few sentimental treasures on an upturned crate. Her most precious item, a tiny hand-knitted pair of baby booties, lay exposed, the single heartbreaking symbol of the hope her husband had held, and the future she now risked losing to the streets. Selling them was not commerce. It was the ultimate sacrifice of a mother protecting her unborn child. The Market Square became her execution ground. The vultures were led by Lady Beatrice Harcourt, the city's undisputed matron of manners, whose malice was as sharp and refined as her diamond brooch. Lady Beatrice and her gaggle of onlookers descended upon Livia's humble stall, turning her plight into a public sport. Every word was designed to draw blood. They sneered at the indecency of her burgeoning belly, openly questioning the paternity, and mocking the very idea that a child born into such destitution could ever be worthy of decent wool booties. The humiliation culminated in a terrifying power play. Lady Beatrice, leveraging her immense social influence, called the market guard, demanding Livia be physically removed from the square for offending public decorum. As the guard laid a rough hand on Livia's pregnant arm, a horrifying spectacle of brute force against feminine vulnerability, Livia's last reserves of strength began to crumble. Her dignity was her only shield, but even that was dissolving into silent tears of despair. It was in this moment of maximum darkness, with Livia cornered and the crowd gleefully anticipating her final collapse, that the ground shifted beneath their feet. A sudden chilling stillness descended as a magnificent crested carriage, the official seal of the most formidable nobleman in the county, rolled unexpectedly into the square. Out stepped Duke Alaric de Ashworth. He was a man of legendary influence, known for his cold calculation and his utter disdain for social theatrics. He saw the brutality, he saw the victim, and then the unthinkable. The Duke, ignoring the matron's demands and the guard's confusion, walked directly to the viuva. He did not buy her pitiful wares. Instead, he made an astonishing, explosive declaration over the roar of the stunned crowd. A statement that didn't just save Livia from ruin, but instantly elevated her to a status of untouchable protection. He threw down a bag of gold, a king's ransom, and pronounced to the silent square, "This viuva is under my protection, and the child she carries is a future Ashworth." A declaration of war? A desperate rescue? A calculated acquisition? The entire rigid structure of Victorian society just cracked under the weight of one powerful man's decision. This shocking act of defiance against social law has silenced the cruelest city, but it has only just begun a tumultuous, volatile alliance. Do not dare look away. The moment Livia and the Duke lock eyes is the moment her fate is sealed. Watch until the very end to see the full, explosive consequence of the Duke's move. The Market Square was a riot of color and commerce, but for Livia Astor it felt like a cold, gray cage. Every vibrant stall, every well-fed customer, every loud, cheerful vendor served as a deliberate, mocking counterpoint to her absolute destitution. The cruelest contrast of all, however, was within herself. She was a vessel of life, yet society had deemed her dead, or worse, indecent. At 7 months pregnant, her condition was impossible to hide. A prominent, unforgivable fact that spoke of a husband lost and a future without protection. She was a widow, pregnant and penniless, a trifecta of social ruin. She had chosen the most secluded, grimiest corner of the square, a shadowed alcove near a refuse pile, for her pitiful stand. Her display was heartbreakingly simple, an upturned wooden crate. On it rested her last few marketable possessions, a tarnished silver hairbrush, a delicately embroidered handkerchief, and at the very center, the ultimate act of maternal sacrifice, a tiny, cherished pair of hand-knitted baby booties. Her husband, a lieutenant lost to a sudden fever abroad, had bought them in a fit of sweet, desperate hope, a future now shattered. Selling those booties wasn't raising funds. It was selling the very ghost of her marital happiness. Livia's voice, usually melodic and clear, was a thin, tremulous plea as she tried to attract buyers. Finely made goods, a gentleman's relic. For a fair price, please. But the buyers did not approach. They averted their eyes, clutching their purses tighter. In Victorian society, poverty was contagious, and Livia's state, her very visibly pregnant state, was a moral blight. The air around her began to thicken with a menacing, focused attention. The ladies who lunch, dressed in excessive layers of expensive velvet and furs, were not there to shop for produce. They were there to witness the show. Their lorgnettes were raised, their whispers sharp as broken glass. The whispers intensified into a focused attack when Lady Beatrice Harcourt made her grand entrance into Livia's shadowed corner. Lady Beatrice, a woman whose influence was only surpassed by her merciless moral rigidity, stopped directly in front of the crate, her black lace parasol tapping impatiently on the cobblestones. Her eyes narrowed as she took in Livia's condition and her pitiful wares. "Good heavens," Lady Beatrice declared, her voice carrying over the din of the market, ensuring maximum audience participation. "Look at the exhibition. Has the parish no shame? A woman in this condition, displaying her unseemly situation for all to witness." Livia forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze, her throat tightening with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. "I seek to earn an honest living, Lady Beatrice. I harm no one." Lady Beatrice let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Honest? Selling the proof of your indelicacy? And look here, children's booties." She used the tip of her elegant boot to nudge the tiny knitwear. "Perhaps you are selling them because the father, whoever the poor wretch may be, left you no funds even for a layette. Or perhaps the child will be born in a workhouse needing no such frivolities." The surrounding spectators laughed, a collective cruel sound that pierced Livia's heart. The pain was immediate, physical, worse than the cold. This wasn't merely social rejection. It was an attack on her child's right to exist with honor. Livia's stoicism finally fractured. A lone, fat tear tracked a path through the dust on her cheek. She could feel the stares, the judgment, the utter lack of human compassion pressing down on her, pushing her toward the floor. The sight of her tears fueled Lady Beatrice's triumph. The market had become a Roman arena, and Livia was the doomed spectacle. She had nowhere left to hide. The lone tear tracing a path on Livia's cheek was all the signal Lady Beatrice Harcourt needed. It was the moment of weakness she had been craving. The final, undeniable proof that the disgraced widow was utterly broken. The air in the immediate vicinity of Livia's humble crate turned toxic, fueled by the collective, self-righteous indignation of the surrounding society ladies. Lady Beatrice, basking in her role as the merciless enforcer of Bristol's moral code, stepped closer. Her voice, usually modulated to the perfect pitch of polite contempt, rose to a piercing theatrical volume, ensuring that her damning judgment reached the farthest corners of the market square. She deliberately addressed the wider crowd, turning Livia's fate into a sermon. "See here, ladies. This is what happens when one trades virtue for recklessness. Not only is this woman reduced to beggary, but she chooses to make a spectacle of her shame on our high street." Lady Beatrice used her ornate ivory fan to point directly at Livia's swollen belly. "Look at the evidence of her folly. And yet she has the audacity to try and sell these pathetic tokens." She reached out and, with the polished tip of her riding crop, flicked the tiny, hand-knitted baby booties off the crate. They tumbled onto the filthy cobblestones, landing with a soft, sickening thud. That sound, the soft, insignificant sound of the tiny booties hitting the dirt, was the cruelest moment of all. It wasn't the verbal assault that shattered Livia. It was the physical desecration of her husband's last gift and her child's future. A gasp escaped Livia's lips, a sound of raw maternal anguish. She instinctively bent, despite the strain on her heavy body, to retrieve the sacred items. Lady Beatrice laughed, a high, mocking peal of triumph. "Such sentimentality. A waste of good wool, I say. Tell me, Livia, dear, will this child even survive the winter in the hovel you occupy, or will it be dropped at the parish doorstep? Another burden on our good Christian wallets." Perhaps you should sell your ring finger next, as a reminder of the husband who conveniently left you so exposed. The provocation was deliberate, designed to shatter the very last remnants of Livia's self-control and provoke a public scene, a screaming fit, a collapse that would justify her permanent removal. Livia straightened up slowly, her body trembling with a white-hot, silent fury that belied her frail appearance. Her eyes, filled with unshed tears, were fixed on Lady Beatrice. She refused to give the matron the satisfaction of a verbal plea or a breakdown. Her silence was her last act of dignity. "You speak of honor," Livia managed, her voice dangerously quiet. "But your words are those of a scavenger, feeding on the pain of a grieving mother." Lady Beatrice bristled, her victory momentarily tainted by Livia's defiance. "Grieving? You are a public menace. Your very presence here is an insult to the respectable businesses that pay their rates. You should be indoors in seclusion, repenting your unfortunate circumstances, not flaunting your misery." The matron stepped back, signaling to her entourage that the show was over, and the time for execution had arrived. The crowd, having gorged on the spectacle, began to disperse, leaving Livia alone, framed by the cold wall and the heartless square, completely undone. Her poverty was not just a lack of money. It was a lack of air, a lack of rights, a complete exposure to public degradation. Livia stared at the gold coins glinting in the mud, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the world pressing down, ready to crush her and her unborn child completely. She had come to the square to survive, and instead she had been systematically disassembled piece by agonizing piece. This was rock bottom. She had nothing left to offer the cruelty of Bristol. The moment of utter vulnerability when Livia retrieved the soiled baby booties was the trigger for Lady Beatrice's final, devastating offensive. The matron of morality sensed her complete victory. Livia was crying, shaking, and utterly defeated. The pitying stares of a few bystanders were rapidly dissolving into fear and embarrassment, prompted by Lady Beatrice's sheer aggression. "Enough of this maudlin performance," Lady Beatrice spat, her silk-gloved hand cutting the air like a razor. She turned, not to the crowd, but to the market guard, the official presence of civic order who had been lingering nearby, avoiding eye contact. "Guard," she commanded, her voice ringing with the unassailable authority of inherited wealth and social standing. "I insist that this woman be immediately removed from the public square. Her state is an affront to decency. Her merchandise is an appeal to base pity, and her presence here is detrimental to the respectable commerce of this city." The guard, a weary man named Thomas, hesitated. He saw the truth. Livia was a poor, grieving woman, not a criminal. But he also saw Lady Beatrice, whose husband sat on the town council. He knew where his wages and his future lay. The fear of the Duke's wrath was distant. The fear of Lady Beatrice's immediate retribution was very real. "Madam," Thomas mumbled, bowing slightly to the matron, then turning to Livia with a look of profound regret. "Mrs. Astor, you must pack up. I have orders to clear this area." Livia's heart slammed against her ribs. Clear this area? That meant eviction, exile, and the almost certain descent into the parish workhouse. A fate she dreaded more than death itself. There, her baby would be taken from her, her identity stripped. This small, miserable corner of the market was her last stand. "No," Livia whispered, the word thin but carrying the heavy weight of absolute refusal. She clutched the edge of the wooden crate with white-knuckled fingers, digging her heels into the grimy cobblestones. "I cannot. I have nowhere to go. I need these few shillings for a room tonight." "For my child," Lady Beatrice scoffed, stepping closer until her heavy skirts almost brushed Livia's threadbare black crepe. The scent of the matron's expensive French perfume, so incongruous with the market smells, choked Livia. "Your need is your burden, not ours, you foolish girl," Lady Beatrice hissed, dropping the pretense of public politeness. "Go to the poorhouse where your kind belong. Do not dare sully this respectable establishment with your ostentatious misery." The matron stepped back and nodded sharply to the guard. "Do your duty, man, now." Thomas, his face flushed with shame, reluctantly placed a firm, rough hand on Livia's shoulder. "Please, Mrs. Astor, do not make this difficult." Livia gasped, a sound torn from her lungs. She looked up not pleadingly but with a fierce, burning accusation in her eyes. The physical contact, the forced removal, was the final, undeniable act of her persecution. Her hands instinctively went to cradle her large, round belly, a silent prayer for the life inside. She was no longer fighting for money, but for her fundamental right to exist, to protect her child. She was being dragged. The humiliating friction of the guard's hand on her arm, the scrape of the crate being overturned, the way the remaining few coins scattered and spun on the cold ground, it all testified to her absolute defeat. She closed her eyes against the burning tears, refusing to utter the plea that would grant Lady Beatrice her final satisfaction. She would not scream. She would not beg. This was the moment the mighty and the morally bankrupt had chosen to finally break her. The humiliation had peaked. The guard was pulling her. The crowd was watching. Livia's world was shrinking into a pinprick of darkness, when suddenly, the overwhelming clamor of the market, the harsh voice of Lady Beatrice, the grinding noise of the city, all went silent. A sound, foreign and commanding, had sliced through the noise. It was the synchronized, powerful clatter of hooves followed by the abrupt, authoritative stop of a carriage of immense wealth. The execution was paused. Every head in the square, including the guards and Lady Beatrice's, snapped toward the carriage, frozen by the undeniable presence of power. The world tilted on its axis the moment the thundering sound of the carriage wheels ceased. Every head snapped around, instantly forgetting the pitiful spectacle of the pregnant widow. The carriage was not merely expensive. It was imposing, marked by the unmistakable, magnificent crest of the Duchy of Ashworth. The air, previously thick with the stench of cruelty, now turned cold, rarefied and utterly silent. Fear, the ultimate social currency, had just been introduced. Out of the carriage stepped Duke Alaric de Ashworth, 40. He was an intimidating figure, tall with a severe aristocratic bone structure and eyes that seemed to have seen, and judged, the entire world. His attire was impeccable, but his presence transcended mere fashion. He moved with the unhurried, unquestioned authority of a king in his own domain. His arrival was as rare as it was unexpected, and the market square, which minutes before had been a bustling tapestry of life, froze solid. The market guard, Thomas, who still had his hand clamped on Livia's arm, recoiled as if burned. He instantly released her and snapped to a rigid, trembling attention. Lady Beatrice, whose face moments ago was flushed with malicious triumph, now turned a sickly ashen white. The Duke's displeasure was a far greater threat to her standing than any widow's poverty. Duke Alaric did not make a sweeping entrance or an eloquent speech. He simply looked. His eyes, cold and analytical, passed over the scene with devastating efficiency. He saw the overturned crate, the scattered coins, the two tiny baby booties lying in the mud. He saw the rigid posture of the shamed guard and the frantic, fearful readjustment of Lady Beatrice's lace shawl. And finally his gaze settled on Livia. She was clutching her belly, her face stained with tears, her frame shaking from the ordeal. Yet even in this state of profound distress, Livia met his gaze. It was a fleeting, fierce, and entirely unspoken communication. In her eyes the Duke saw not supplication, but a raw, burning dignity, the only thing Lady Beatrice had failed to strip away. The tension was a taut wire ready to snap. The entire square held its collective breath, anticipating the reason for the Duke's shocking descent into the market's lowest corner. Was he here to chastise the guard? To scold the matron? To buy some exotic trinket? Alaric walked slowly toward the small, desolate scene. His progress felt endless, each footfall on the cobblestones an indictment of the people gathered. He ignored the frantic whispered greetings of the high-ranking citizens who tried to bow and scrape their way into his periphery. His focus remained laser-like, fixed on the shattered figure of the widow. He stood before Livia, towering over her. The contrast was stark, his overwhelming power and her desperate fragility. The silence of the crowd was a heavy, suffocating blanket. He did not speak to Livia, nor did he speak to Lady Beatrice. Instead, he bent. The sight of the Duke of Ashworth, the most powerful man in the city, whose family history stretched back centuries, bending low on the dirty ground of the common market, sent a fresh wave of paralyzed shock through the witnesses. Alaric reached out, not toward Livia, but toward the ground. He retrieved the pair of baby booties that Lady Beatrice had scornfully knocked into the dirt. He held them in his large gloved hand, examining the tiny, pathetic object with an air of profound stillness. He then straightened, holding the small item. His action was a silent, devastating judgment against the cruelty of the society that had trampled on something so innocent and sacred. He had witnessed their malice, and now he held the evidence of their sin. The stage was set, the cruelty exposed, and the audience was trembling. The Duke's next move, everyone knew, would be nothing short of seismic. His silence had prepared the room. Now his voice would deliver the unimaginable. The air in the market square had become so thin with shock that no one dared to inhale. Duke Alaric de Ashworth stood tall, holding the tiny, soiled baby booties, the pathetic testament to Livia's despair and Lady Beatrice's malice. He had witnessed the core rottenness of his society, and now he was about to deliver a verdict far more brutal than any judge could issue. Alaric did not address the guard. He did not address the petrified Lady Beatrice. His powerful, unblinking eyes were fixed solely on Livia. She braced herself for the expected. A lecture, a stern donation, a cold dismissal. Instead, what came next was an act of such staggering subversion that it threatened to dismantle the very foundations of their rigid world. The Duke casually tossed the heavy velvet purse of gold, far larger than any sensible man carried, onto Livia's overturned crate. It landed with a dull thud that spoke volumes of its immense worth. "This is not a purchase," Alaric announced, his voice carrying an acoustic authority that brooked no argument. "This is a settlement. For your time, for your dignity, and for the public inconvenience caused by your poverty." Livia stared at the gold, then back at the Duke, utterly bewildered. He had just given her a fortune, enough to secure a life of modest comfort for years, but the act felt less like charity and more like a preparatory move in a game of chess she didn't understand. Then, the true shock came. Alaric took a deliberate step closer to Livia. He did not touch her, but the sheer proximity of the city's most formidable man to the most disgraced woman sent a palpable wave of scandal through the crowd. He raised his voice, ensuring his words were heard clearly over the square's unnerving silence. He was no longer speaking to Livia. He was addressing the entire city through its terrified representatives. "Lady Beatrice," he commanded, his tone dropping into a deadly whisper that was somehow more frightening than a shout. "You spoke of this woman's loneliness. You spoke of her indecency. You spoke of a child without a name. You sought to expel her." He paused, letting the silence magnify the anticipation. He placed his left hand, the powerful hand that governed estates and industrial empires, gently but firmly on Livia's shoulder. It was a gesture of unquestionable possession. Then came the detonation. "You were mistaken," Alaric pronounced, his voice ringing with absolute, terrifying conviction. "This widow is not without protection. She is not without resources, and she is certainly not without honor." He gave Livia's shoulder a slow, deliberate squeeze, his eyes locking with the stunned, terrified face of Lady Beatrice. "This widow is henceforth my acknowledged and immediate protected. And as for the child she carries," he continued, his gaze sweeping over the astonished crowd, cementing the truth of his statement. "Understand this. The son or daughter she bears is a future Ashworth." The Duke of Ashworth had done the impensable, unthinkable. He had taken the gravest social risk possible, implying he would marry her or at the very least, elevate her and her unborn child to his name and lineage, all to crush the petty malice of an assembly of cruel aristocrats. He hadn't just bought her freedom. He had declared a strategic public alliance that would forever silence her critics and shatter his own notorious image of cold detachment. Lady Beatrice gasped, a strangled sound of utter defeat, as if a physical fist had struck her. Her face, moments before radiating pride, now crumpled into a mask of pure terror. She realized with dawning horror that she hadn't ruined Livia. She had inadvertently delivered her into the arms of the most powerful man in Bristol, sealing her own rapid social demise. Livia was paralyzed. The words echoed in her ears. A future Ashworth. This was a monumental lie, a reckless, beautiful fabrication, but one spoken by the only man who could make it instantly true. She looked up at the Duke, her heart hammering against the wall of her ribs, her question, "Why?" burning unspoken in her tear-filled eyes. The sheer audacity of his act had wiped away all her shame, replacing it with a terrifying, exhilarating power. She was no longer a beggar. She was the central, incomprehensible figure in a scandal that would rock the nation. The declaration, "The child she carries is a future Ashworth," struck the market square with the force of a cannon shot. For a society built on titles, lineage, and rigid control, this was not just a scandal. It was an act of social terrorism. The most powerful man in Bristol, renowned for his icy detachment and impeccable control, had just publicly staked his reputation on a penniless pregnant widow. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Lady Beatrice Harcourt, the instigator of the cruelty, staggered backward, her face contorted in a mixture of disbelief and utter terror. Her carefully constructed facade of moral authority shattered. She was no longer the judge. She was the victim of the Duke's crushing judgment. Her voice caught in a choking sound as she realized the catastrophic error of targeting a woman who was, apparently, about to be linked by blood to the highest family in the county. The market guard, Thomas, dropped the pretense of order entirely and stood immobile, his eyes fixed on the Duke's powerful hand resting on Livia's shoulder. Livia herself was caught in the eye of the storm. One moment she was bracing for eviction and the workhouse. The next, she was enveloped in a shield of insurmountable power. Her shock was profound, but as she looked out at the faces of the women who had mocked her, the humiliation of the past hour curdled into a cold, fierce satisfaction. Their faces were no longer mocking. They were terrified. The silence they now offered was a tribute, a forced respect purchased by the Duke's audacity. The intense, silent exchange between Livia and Duke Alaric was the core of the drama. Her tear-filled eyes conveyed her disbelief and the burning question, why this lie? Why this immense risk? His eyes, cold and challenging, offered no easy answers, only a stark, powerful demand. You take my power now. You accept the consequence. This was Livia's moment to choose. She could have stammered a denial, exposed his lie, and maintained her tattered independence, condemning herself to the streets. Or she could embrace the frightening, exhilarating power he offered. She looked at the gold on the crate, then at the tiny, soiled booties, and finally at the defeated glare of Lady Beatrice. The choice was clear. She would not crawl back to poverty for the sake of polite truth. With a slow, deliberate movement, Livia reached down with the hand not secured by the Duke. She picked up the velvet bag of gold with a steady hand, securing her child's survival. Then she retrieved the baby booties and held them close to her heart, a silent oath to her late husband. She lifted her chin, meeting the Duke's gaze with a fierce, unwavering assent. The pact was sealed. She accepted the protection, the lie, and the terrifying, unknown future that came with the name Ashworth. Alaric saw the steel return to her eyes, and a flicker of something akin to approval crossed his severe face. He had not gambled on sentiment. He had invested in courage. The matter is concluded, Alaric declared, his voice cutting the tension. He turned his attention back to Lady Beatrice, and his last words to her were the final crushing blow. You may report to your associates, Lady Harcourt, that your lack of compassion has inadvertently created an alliance of profound consequence. I suggest you remember your manners when addressing my future Duchess. Lady Beatrice, utterly destroyed, could only manage a feeble nod. Alaric then smoothly extended his arm to Livia, moving with the practiced grace of a man who takes what he wills. Livia placed her arm in his, a delicate hand resting on a sleeve of ironclad authority. They turned together, leaving the remnants of Livia's stall, the overturned crate and the few scattered coins. As monuments to the day, Bristol's social hierarchy was dramatically upended by one man's audacious defiance. Livia had walked into the square a pauper. She was leaving as a formidable figure of mystery and power, enveloped in the unassailable aura of the House of Ashworth. The departure of Livia Astor and Duke Alaric de Ashworth was a spectacle of hushed, profound surrender. As the Duke guided Livia toward his carriage, the crowd parted instantly, their previous scorn replaced by an overwhelming, terrified reverence. Livia was no longer the beggar. She was a sacred, untouchable figure, shrouded in the terrifying, magnificent shadow of the Duke. Lady Beatrice, left behind, stood utterly vanquished, her power dissolving like mist in the face of the Ashworth name. The Duke helped Livia into the opulent confines of his private carriage. The interior was a world of rich, dark velvet and polished mahogany, a sanctuary that smelled of fine leather and money, a stark contrast to the grime and cruelty of the market square. Livia, clutching her gold and the beloved baby booties, sank into the plush seating, her heart still hammering against the walls of her chest. The carriage pulled away, its swift motion signaling a complete break from her past. The Duke sat opposite her, his gaze unwavering, analytical, and utterly unreadable. This was the moment of reckoning, the time for the truth behind the grand seismic lie. Your Grace, Livia finally managed. her voice steadier now, laced with a new, necessary steel. "The protection you offered, the gold, I accept. But the declaration you made, a future Ashworth, is a profound fabrication. You risked your name for a stranger. Why? What is the nature of this protection?" Alaric did not flinch. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his intensity filling the space between them. This was not a sentimental hero. This was a man who only acted when the stakes were highest, and the return was guaranteed. The lie, the Duke stated, his voice a low, compelling rumble, was the only currency those imbeciles understood. "Your tears would have bought you nothing but a workhouse cot. My name, Livia, bought you unquestionable safety." He continued, his analysis cutting deep into the core of her despair. "You endured the insults with a silent, unflinching dignity. You fought for those ridiculous little shoes with the ferocity of a lioness. You, Livia, possess a strength of character that none of those withered society roses could ever hope to attain. I saw a rare, valuable asset being publicly destroyed by small-minded malice. I invested not in your person, but in your unbroken will." He extended his powerful hand, not to touch her, but to point to her pregnant belly. "That child, whether Ashworth or otherwise, is now yours to raise without fear. That gold secures your accommodation, your health care, your privacy. The Ashworth name secures your immunity from further social assault. They will fear me too much to touch my protégé." Livia looked at him not with gratitude, but with dawning comprehension. He hadn't saved her out of love or chivalry. He had done it out of respect for power, her power to endure, his power to command. "And what is the price of this alliance, Your Grace?" she challenged, her gaze meeting his without flinching. "What do you require in return for staking the most powerful name in the city?" Alaric allowed a faint, complex expression, a hint of a smile quickly suppressed to cross his lips. "Only your continued strength, Livia. I require an ally at my side who is not easily broken by gossip or sentiment. I am tired of the predictable fawning of the aristocracy. You have proven yourself utterly unpredictable, utterly formidable. For now you will move into my dower house. You will recover your strength. You will raise your child in peace. And when the time is right, you will stand beside me, demonstrating to the world that the Duke of Ashworth protects what is worthy." The carriage slowed, pulling up before a magnificent, discreet manor house, far grander than anything Livia had ever known. She had traded her fight for survival for a high-stakes partnership with a powerful, calculating force. The future was not yet clear, but one thing was, Livia Astor had survived the market square, and she was entering her new life not as a rescued beggar, but as a challenging, necessary figure in the Duke's formidable strategy. The ultimate confrontation with her fate, and with the Duke himself, was just beginning. The polished mahogany doors of the Duke's carriage clicked shut, sealing Livia Astor inside a sudden, shocking sanctuary. The market square, the site of her deepest humiliation, vanished behind the glass, replaced by the speeding, silent authority of Ashworth power. Livia was no longer the scorned widow. She was the Duke's chosen, the central figure in a scandal so grand it commanded the awe and terror of the entire city. She looked across the velvet interior at Duke Alaric. He had not offered comfort or compassion, but a strategic alliance born of ruthless observation. He hadn't seen her tears. He had seen her unbroken will. He had chosen her not as a wife, but as a weapon against the very society that deemed him cold and her despicable. Livia clutched the gold and the tiny baby booties, the two objects representing her desperate past and her formidable future. She had accepted the biggest lie of her life to secure the truest thing, her child's right to survive with dignity. Back in the square, Lady Beatrice Harcourt was already facing the whirlwind of social ruin. Her petty cruelty, meant to destroy a single woman, had earned her the eternal freezing contempt of the Duke of Ashworth. The story of the pregnant Viuva and the Duke's shocking declaration would become an instant legend, whispered behind every lace fan and beneath every silk cloak. The aristocracy had tasted their own medicine, and it was bitter. Their fear of the Duke now extended to Livia, cloaking her in an impervious shield of respect. This is where the true, complex drama begins. The rescue was merely the opening gambit. Livia is now faced with the most challenging role of her life, becoming the Duchess in name, living under the intense scrutiny of the Duke's formidable presence. Is this a liberation or a more gilded form of captivity? Can a woman who fought so fiercely for her independence truly submit to the rule of a man who sees her as a valuable asset. Livia knows the cost of this safety is her compliance, but the Duke has profoundly underestimated the fire he has just brought into his gilded cage. He wanted an ally of courage. He has acquired a woman who will demand respect, not simply receive it as a consequence of his title. The future of the Ashworth line, whether through marriage or through his unprecedented protection of her child, is now inextricably linked to the viuva he saved from the dirt. She has secured her survival, but the ultimate conflict, the battle for her heart and the struggle to shape her destiny against the will of the most powerful man in the city, has just commenced. The Market Square humiliation is over, but the game of power, dignity, and unexpected passion is just about to explode inside the walls of the Duke's empire.